Right, well, good afternoon. I'm Rich Haverman, Co-Professor of Science and Global Studies here at the University of Wisconsin. This is the eighth installment, the eighth installment of our lecture series on constitutional law. And this week, I'm very happy to introduce Ken Kirsch. Kirsch is a professor of political science at Boston College. His primary interests are American political and constitutional developments, American political thought, politics of the courts, and he is the recipient of the American Political Science Association's Edward S. Corwin Award and the J. David Greenstone Prize from the APS's Politics and History section. He's won numerous awards for his work on the history of the Supreme Court. Professor Kirsch has published many articles in academic, intellectual, and popular journals, notably not Political Science Reviewer. That will happen fairly soon. He's the author of 5 books: American Political Thought, An Invitation, Conservatives in the Constitution, Imagining Constitutional Restoration in the Heyday of American Liberalism, The Supreme Court and American Political Development, and Constructing Civil Liberties, Discontinuities in Development of American Constitutional Law, and a book on free speech called Freedom of Speech, Rights and Liberties Under the Law. He's a member of the Bar of New York, Massachusetts, and the District of Columbia. He received his Bachelor of Arts from Williams College and his JD from Northwestern University, and his PhD in government from Cornell University. Please give a warm Madison. That's encouraging.
Thanks so much, Rick, and thanks to all of you for coming out to this, and my appreciation to the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy at the University of Wisconsin. Northwestern is actually what brought me to Madison for the first time when I was in law school. You know, a friend's sister went to school here, and he came up for a weekend. So I won't say any more about that. It was a lot of fun. My more recent visits have been a little more scholarly. I want to thank the center. I want to make one small correction, not to the introduction, but to the listing. The listing says that I'm going to talk about conservative approaches to legal interpretation. I'm actually going to talk about conservative approaches to constitutional interpretation, which is just one type of legal interpretation. And I'm going to do it on April Fool's Day. We'll see whether I live up to that billing. Okay, so we'll begin. In a striking, to me at least, article published in the Cornell Law Review in 2019, the Columbia Law School professor David Posen and his co-authors asked a very simple question, and they used cutting-edge technology to arrive at the answer to that question. By cutting-edge technology, at least I don't know much about it, but big data, machine learning, all of that sort of thing. And what Posen and his co-authors asked is, who is making constitutional arguments in the public sphere, in public life in the United States today? And they found a really clear answer to that. And the answer is conservatives, Republicans. And not only did they outpace liberals, Democrats, but there was a chasm, a virtual chasm between the Republicans and the Democratic Party to the extent that they made constitutional arguments. And this is not legal interpretation. This is in public life, in political rhetoric, in the public sphere. And one thing that they found is that the Democrats had all but abandoned any allusions or arguments about the Constitution in public life. So that to them was a very striking finding. Obviously, they must have suspected a disjunction between the two parties. And they found it. And they called this phenomenon constitutional polarization. And that is no small matter. In a country that models itself, or styles itself, a constitutionally nationalist country, a country characterized by constitutional patriotism. Scholars have said that America's, their type of patriotism often references fidelity to their constitution. So this polarization in both parties is a good thing. And one thing Posen and the others also noted was that the Republicans have developed a special skill since the 1970s and 80s in generating a distinctive form of constitutional partisan rhetoric. So look, I mean, in a way, you probably already know this, right? For the Republican Party, the Constitution, and for conservatives, for the most part, the Constitution has become a brand, an identity, and also a tool and a strategy for political and social movement mobilization. Obviously, this is dovetailed with the particular type of populism that people talk about in contemporary Republican politics, contemporary American politics, and it fits. Look, this was also true in 19th century Republican populist politics. It's tied to a historical narrative of elites having taken possession of our Constitution, corrupted it, right? And the call is for, we are going to rally to defend our Constitution. So the Republicans really, they found since the 1970s and 1980s, have come to own the Constitution, right? And the liberal Democrats have fled. We even see this in the new, Donald Trump Bible, right? The God Bless America, if I have that right, God Bless the United States Bible, which put out by Donald Trump. He needs money right now, cash. I guess a $60 Bible is one way to raise it, besides vodka, airlines, steaks, and other things. It has the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Pledge of Allegiance, and the lyrics of Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA, right? All of equal weight, right? Okay, so that is the Constitution in public life. And one thing I've tried to do in my work is always to think about legal interpretation and legal theories of conservatives concerning the Constitution. I think it's a mistake to sort of not think about that as acting in tandem with the more political social movement mobilization theories, because obviously they work together. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about really what my book does, which is, my book is really a story of post-war constitutional development. So it really does focus, it's not a book mostly about contemporary politics. It focuses on 1950, basically, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education to the election of Ronald Reagan. So now I want to talk about the different trajectories of what I've just described and conservative theories in the legal sphere of constitutional picture. Okay? So when I talk about development, I could graph this if I had any skills. I was actually an economics major. I should have those skills. They fall into desert. So look, in the public and popular sphere, I've already told you what the graph would look like, right? Especially the parties were at parity until the 1970s and 1980s in constitutional rhetoric, but they diverged radically since the 1970s and 80s, with the Republicans going up and the Democrats going down. But it's an upward trajectory on the way. Okay. Now I want to turn to constitutional argument in what I would call the academic sphere or the intellectual sphere. And these are more sophisticated theories about how the Constitution should be interpreted. And the story there is not one of one party going up and the other party going down, and we're going to focus on conservatives. It's not the story of Republicans, conservatives, constitutional argument going up, but it's a story of bifurcation, right? That both conservatives and liberals in this period that I'm talking about, post-war America, right? They both were arguing about what the Constitution means, how it should be understood, right? But they were doing it in completely different sectors, right? The liberal Democrats, right, they owned academia, right? They basically, all of the constitutional theory liberal Democrats did and undertook took place in American law schools. And for all intents and purposes, there were no conservatives in American law schools. I don't mean that literally. There were plenty of people who were conservatives in American law schools and they were law professors, but they were not teaching constitutional law. Business law, torts, trust in the states, whatever. They were not doing constitutional theory, right? There was a hegemony, and liberal Democrats, they did their high-level constitutional theory in the law schools, right? Essentially, this was the only game in town, right? For high-level constitutional theory. And you might say how does that matter, right? Well, this is how it matters, right? There was a particular orientation to this type of constitutional theory. It was focused on the idea that the United States was a democracy. Okay? Now, look, that sounds very basic, but actually it isn't very basic. It's a particular thing, right? It is the idea that the majority should rule. And this was one of the primary arguments of the progressive movement. The progressive movement, of course, that was so influential at the University of Wisconsin, and Wisconsin played such a leadership role in. Okay? And the focus there was on judicial review, right? The authority of judges to declare null and void laws passed by democratically elected legislatures. The view there was that judicial review was an aberrant institution in a democracy. In other words, it required special justification. Because in a democracy, the legislature, the people are supposed to rule and the people's elected representatives are supposed to rule. So if a judge is striking down a law and saying it's unconstitutional, this was called by Alexander Bickel at Yale Law School the counter-majoritarian difficulty. And most of liberal constitutional theory in the law schools focused on the judge and how the judge could be justified in performing this counter-majoritarian act. And that's what liberal constitutional theory was. It was focused on giving advice to judges on how they should be analyzing cases in a way that would justify them striking down laws passed by a Democratic majority. And in the nature of that, this was a theory, these were theories of interpretation that were offered to judges. And that's what was called constitutional theory in post-war America until very recently. Okay. Now, what about conservative constitutional theory in this same period? That's what I think this book contributes, or at least frames the issue in a different way. One thing I say in this book is that there was plenty of conservative argument about the Constitution and what the Constitution means and how it should be understood in this very same time period. But it looked to most Americans who were not conservatives that there wasn't any conservative thinking about the Constitution. Question is, where were the conservatives doing their constitutional theory if they were not in the law schools? And it turns out one place they were in political science departments. Right? Very often under the auspices of the political theory side of political science departments. But there were also other places. So there were journalists who did this in, for example, National Review, a guy named James Jackson Kilpatrick, right? So there would be magazines, but there are also intellectual magazines, intellectual journals of the sort that has resided here at the University of Wisconsin, the Political Science Reviewer, right? But these are other journals on the right called Modern Age, Human Events, and there were a whole bunch of others, and also National Review. And then, this probably won't surprise you either. The conservatives had their own publishers, book publishers. One of them is still thriving. It's called Regnery, right? But they also had lesser known ones, which were quite well known on the right, called Devon Adair and Arlington House. And they wrote about the Constitution constantly. And they wrote about it at a very high level. But most law professors to this day are not aware of any of this constitutional theory. They didn't read it, and it wasn't being done in the law schools by law professors. Okay. So what was the nature of this constitutional theory? Well, the interesting thing to me about this is that it was not of the nature that I just described to you in the liberal constitution. It was not focused on democracy. It was not focused on judicial review. It did not consider judicial review to present a counter-majoritarian difficulty, and it was not focused on the judge. Okay? Very different, but still it was focused on the Constitution. If it wasn't focused on those things, it was also not focused on methodology. It didn't provide methodological recommendations to judges on the right way to interpret the Constitution. What this political theory on the right was substantive. It was not method, but it was ideology. And by the way, I don't mean to use ideology here in a critical way necessarily. What I mean by ideology here is that it presented a worldview that was coherent and unitary about the nature of the polity, about the nature of our political system. Again, it was not focused on what a judge should do. And I'm using the term ideological. All I mean is that it has a substantive vision rather than a methodological focus. And now, the conservatives in this period disagreed about how the Constitution should be understood. This arena for constitutional debate was pluralist. It was contested. It was roiling. It was diverse. And in the book, I go into some detail. I'm not going to do that here about one axis of disagreement amongst these conservatives. And that is an axis between structuralists and moralists. I'll just say very simply, right? Structuralists emphasize exactly what you would think: separation of powers, federalism, the institutions that were set up by the American Constitution that emphasized how we have a system both of popular government, but limited government, popular rule and limited government. Okay? The moralists, on the other hand, emphasize the moral foundations of law. And that's a very different thing. They, one phrase that's been used to describe the moralists is they emphasize redemptive propositionalism. Right? Propositionalism is, do you believe in the following moral foundations? Right? In one prominent case, in the equality of natural rights. Are you committed to that? As the Declaration of Independence is committed to that, as Lincoln is committed to that, right? And those people actually disagreed not only about what we should focus on as the core of the Constitution, but they had a different historical focus. The first group mostly focused on the 1700s, the founding, 1787, 1789. The latter group, the moralists, focused on the Civil War and Lincoln, right? So, it gets very complicated, but they were really deeply deeply antagonistic, sometimes brutally towards each other. And there were other types. So this was a very, very lively area of constitutional debate, but it was highly ideological, and it was rooted in the foundations of conservative political thought more generally, rather than in the law schools. Okay, so now I'm going to bring things up to the present day, keeping an eye on the clock. Okay, so now as all of this is happening, obviously, the world is not standing still. The Republicans, the conservative movement is gaining power. First within the Republican Party, Barry Goldwater's nomination in 1964 for president is the beginning of a serious attempt by the conservatives to capture the Republican Party. Obviously, Goldwater ultimately loses, so that is set back to a certain extent, but it keeps going. And what starts to happen is the Republican Party begins its ascent to power in national politics, states, culminating in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Okay, so the first contemporary interpretive theory I want to talk about is an answer to the question by a rising conservative movement. How do we get into this academic game, right? How do we penetrate this liberal dominance of law schools, right? How do we get our foot in the door there, right? And that ends up becoming a question of, if you're out of power, how do we get a seat at the table at their game, right? You can just go in and say, oh, I don't want to play your game. We look at things differently. They did not start that way. They're like, we want a seat at your poker table, and we want the possibility of winning, right? So what they do is they decide to play the liberals' game. And in doing so, they invent something called originalism, right? Which is a theory of how a judge should interpret the text of the Constitution in a way that would justify the judge in using his or her powers of judicial review to strike down a law. It is a method, and it is concerned with the counter-majoritarian difficulties, right? That's what originalism is, right? It's invented by the Republicans at a particular time, at a moment where they're looking for a foot in the door in the elite legal academy. And they create an organization called the Federalist Society, which some of you may know a little about, or I don't know, do you? It's founded in 1982. It's founded by law students, conservative law students at Yale and at the University of Chicago. Okay, so that is those are elite law schools, obviously, and it is an effort by them to play the game according to the liberal regime and to beat the liberals at their own game. As it happens, they're able to mobilize originalism in the academy. They got their foot in the door. They also talked about restoring the founders' constitution during the political campaign of Ronald Reagan, just as Barry Goldwater had done it in the popular realm. And what's different this time is Ronald Reagan wins, right? And with the win by the movement conservatives, the Federalist Society then starts to assume a larger role than a law school club. What happens is that the Reagan administration and these people can now appoint judges. And the Reagan Justice Department takes a leadership role in vetting judges who are going to subscribe to this new interpretive method called originalism, right? And that's only increased over time. Okay, so originalism is the conservative approach to how the Constitution should be read, but it's playing the game of the liberal democratic regime since it rose in that point in time. Now, I'm gonna bring this up to the present day, right? I think maybe 10 years ago, most people would have said, and a lot of people still say, that I should stop the lecture there. Right? That conservative Republicans, their constitutional theory is originalism. And everybody knows that. All the judges profess to be originalists. And that's it. Okay, but here's the problem. Real movement conservatives who had these deep substantive ideological roots did not appreciate, they appreciated originalism, they appreciate originalists, it got them somewhere, but it was still playing the liberal Democrats' game of methodology rather than political philosophy, rather than substance, rather than conservative ideology. And the originalists started to grate against them. They didn't like it. They said, enough of this. We want a law. Here's, in a way, the way I've described this is originalism really doesn't have a strong connection to conservative political thought. Okay, necessarily. Certainly it was presented as if it did, but it doesn't. It's still playing the liberals' game. So what's happening now in the past 10 years is that that originalism has started to, people have gotten more vocal about their dissatisfaction with originalism as the conservative political theory. Now that they control so many judges and more all the time, they want a more openly and pervasively conservative approach to constitutional interpretation. So what has happened in the past few years is that there have arisen some challengers to originalism on the right. Okay. There are two, right, approaches that are now vying for some prominence. One of them is called common good constitutionalism. Okay. And its foremost proponent is a law professor at Harvard, a conservative Catholic law professor at Harvard, and very obviously conservative Catholic law professor at Harvard, who wrote a book called Common Good Constitutionalism, in which he attacks originalism and says we should ditch it. Conservatives should ditch it, and they should ditch it for my theory, which he's very clear to say has nothing to do with judicial review, has nothing to do with advice to judges. I don't presume that we're in a democracy where the majority should always rule. I'm going to play the conservative game on our own terms. I'm out of that game, right? And here's what I propose. The standard for a judge should be the flourishing of a well-ordered political community, right? It's not just a judge, a legislature, a legislator, a president, a bureaucrat, right? And a judge. Everybody should think about what policy would advance the common good. What would be the best society in a moral sense? Right? That would be conducive to human flourishing. Now, this phrase human flourishing, not incidentally, has deep substantive political theory roots. The touchstones for Adrian Vermeule, if you look at his footnotes, are Aristotle, Cicero, and most of all, St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay? And there's such a thing as the whole. It is uniform. We can arrive at the idea of what is best through reason, right? And the government, including understandings of the Constitution, should be interpreted in view of the supreme good. Okay? And look, I mean, this argument has appealed to, especially to the moralists within the conservative movement. And at the ground level, it has appealed to the Christian right, which has played a huge part, an increasing role in the conservative movement. Although it's in a particular Catholic idiom. People talk about, oh, how influential the evangelical Christians are, right? And obviously they are politically. But the intellectual leadership is being done by the conservative Catholics. in this. Okay, so that is common good constitutionalism. I noticed that my former colleague Patrick Deneen is your last lecturer, I guess, this year. I mean, he's in this school. He's not a constitutional person, but he blurbed Vermeule's book. He's anti-liberal, if that's fair to say, conservative Catholic, and he and Vermeule are like this. So that's the political theory. So that's a challenge to originalism. There's a second, and this is the final one I'm going to list before bringing this to a close. There is also a rising approach, which is different from originalism, different from common good constitutionalism, called traditionalism, often called history and tradition. Often I say these are really pretty new theories. There are just a few people who have been doing this. But this one is particularly interesting because it's popped up in some major Supreme Court opinions already. And I'll tell you about those in a sec. So there are figures here, Mark de Girolami, who was at St. John's and I think he just moved somewhere, Catholic University, I think. Sharif Gurgis, who's at Notre Dame. Again, I guess these are Catholic thinkers as well. Okay. Point. Gurgis wrote an article in NYU Law Review called Living Traditionalism, and this is their interpretive theory. The court should be guided by post-ratification practice. In other words, it shouldn't just focus on the text, and it shouldn't just focus on the founding era, right? It should also look to the practices of the American people since ratification. They refer to this as our traditions. They mean our traditions as a political community. The word they didn't use, but I think in the conservative movement I've seen used, but they should use, is American heritage. What is our heritage, right? And that's a more open thing than what was in the founders. So I'll just read to you some examples from these opinions where this has already popped up in the opinions. Dobbs, overruling Roe v. Wade, right? Justice Samuel Alito, who wrote the opinion for the court, said in deciding whether abortion is a constitutional right, we are guided by, if guided by history and tradition, we can see that the Due Process Clause did not protect abortion. And that's a very distinctive history and tradition argument. In the Bremerton decision, some of you may know this. This is the Washington State football coach who led a prayer at the 50-yard line, right? The court upheld this. Neil Gorsuch said the Establishment Clause must be understood with reference to historical practices and understandings. Once again, that is a traditionalist statement. And then finally, probably the most famous example of this was Justice Clarence Thomas in the Broome Second Amendment case, where Thomas said only firearm regulation consistent with this nation's historical traditions fall outside the Second Amendment's unqualified command. Again, a history and tradition argument. My ultimate argument here is that we're starting to see the conservative movement finally operating in the constitutional realm as if it's their regime to define, rather than operating according to the parameters set by a New Deal liberal regime. But they disagree. They disagree about what the best approach for doing that is. So I have a few concluding remarks. Look, the Democrats have been hegemonic in constitutional theory for a very long time. And what happens if you're hegemonic? Another word for this is a monoculture. And Democrats really, I don't think, understand that this is happening. They're confused by it. And that means that they're striking at shadows. The most recent book by Justice Stephen Breyer is still arguing between originalism and living constitutionalism. He's out of touch, right? Does not understand the way that conservative thought has developed and conservative constitutional theory has developed in recent years. But they're starting to wake up to this. And I think one of the things they're most shocked about is that conservative ideologies and substantive ideas of the post-war period that I described are now starting to appear in academic venues and even on the Supreme Court. Pretty soon, they're not going to have the luxury of not understanding these things. They've already noticed Deneen and Vermeule. And once they realize that the conservative movement in the legal and constitutional realm is no longer debating methods and theories of interpretation aimed at judges, that they are no longer preoccupied with democracy and majority rule as the standard, they're going to suddenly realize that the conservatives are importing conservative, substantive conservative ideas and ideology into the Constitution. And the response to that is they're going to have to develop their own non-method focused substantive vision and make a political case for it. They're not going to be able to hide up behind method and say, oh, the conservative Supreme Court is being activist. Or what about democracy? Is this an appropriate use of the judicial review power? Right? That's not where the debate is anymore on the right. And they are going to have to abandon their method and come up with their own strongly defended substantive vision of what a progressive constitution will look like. And to make matters harder, that they have to make that appeal to the American people, of course, which is that's called doing politics, right? And it's called doing constitutional politics. And one thing that they're going to have to do is get over that constitutional polarization that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture. They're not going to be able to do that by not talking about the Constitution in public life. They're going to have to come up with their own vision, and it's going to have to be a substantive vision, and they're going to have to make the case for it, and they're going to have to argue against conservative political thought and not just about judicial review and activist judges. And once they do that, if they do that, I think they have a chance. It may take many years of being back in the game, and it would make it finally something like a fair fight. Okay, that's my talk. So I guess we take questions, right? Yes, sir.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, how does Article 5 of the Constitution play into originalism? And is it possible that, yeah, I'll just leave it as, how does Article 5 play into originalism in terms that you can change the Constitution under certain guidelines? Because it allows for change.
Yes. Okay. It definitely plays into originalism. So look, Article 5 is the amendment process of the Constitution. And one of the characteristic and in some ways distinctive features of the US Constitution is that it's very hard to amend compared to other constitutions. Okay, so yes, we can amend the Constitution by a 2/3 vote of Congress and 3/4 vote of the states. Right, and look, that's very strenuous, particularly in cases of partisan polarization. Right now, it's been amended 27 times, so it's happened, usually in very fervent particular periods where there's an opportunity to do that. But originalists say we are not against constitutional change. Right, we are not against updating the Constitution. We're not against living constitutionalism to change with the times. But we are textualists, and we do follow the understandings of the text that were laid out by the founders, and they provided a means for change. And the means is change the text, right? And the original method of changing the text is using the Article 5 amendment process. Okay, but I do think, more as a political scientist rather than just a textualist, you do have to consider that in light of the difficulty of amending the Constitution, and in many cases, politically, the impossibility of amending. And what many liberal Democrats say is, look, there have always been broad constructionists, that the Constitution is short, that it's written in generalities, that at least some of the founders thought it should be broadly construed to achieve its objectives. Alexander Hamilton, John Marshall, right? And that it is appropriate for judges to read the Constitution broadly to help make it apply effectively to the times. And that's especially true when it's so difficult to amend. So look, obviously the originalists say that that's not the method of change that the founders wanted or that's in the text. But the counter example to that is that the way the difficulty of the amendment process means that we can get saddled very easily with a dysfunctional constitution if the judges don't have leeway to interpret it in a more flexible and a less straitjacket method. Is that?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So I found this talk immensely interesting, and thank you for coming. The question I'm thinking about is you sort of were describing why liberals are reluctant to play the substantive constitutionalism game that you're inviting them to play. And I wanted to pose a sort of alternative, though I don't necessarily think contradictory explanation, see what you think of it. So you use words like method and procedure, that they're too wrapped up in method and procedure, especially when trying to get judges to do what they want them to do. The word that I was thinking about as you were giving your talk was also pluralism. They may be committed to pluralism in a way where they'll see a substantive conception of the good as conflicting with some bedrock, deeper principle of modern American constitutionalism supposed to, allow for conflicting conceptions of the good to live alongside each other in some degree of harmony or at least peace. And so I'm wondering if that might be a related and even greater reason why liberals are maybe losing the race to get to this substantive question that you're pushing for legal scholars of all stripes to go for. Do you find that persuasive at all? What do you think of that alternative account?
I do find it pretty, I didn't mention it because it gets too complicated.
Right.
But look, there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. Look, so let me paraphrase that, at least as I understand it, and agree with part of it. So one argument is that, you know what, it's not that they just don't know what's happening on the other side. It's that there's an inherent difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party has been pretty willing to, express a clear conception of the good. At least, the standard story of the post-war Republicans and conservatives is fusionism, right? Basically traditionalism plus libertarianism married together. And at least if you have that by two-part pluralism, that they're pretty comfortable speaking in one voice. Whereas the current Democratic Party, especially since the McGovern reforms in the 1970s, really has become just a coalition of interests who each don't really want to sign on to the vision of other interests. So whatever agreements they make to unite into a party is purely transactional rather than theoretical, right? We will vote for you in our own interest, right? And so they do not have a robust conception of the good. They bracketed it as a good liberal would do, right? Liberal in the John Locke sense, right? We don't want any conception of the good. That is one possibility. And I think there's a lot of truth to it, right? That it wouldn't work. They can't agree. They can't agree on any conception of the good. So that's one possibility, and part of that is, is they don't have a particular reverence for the Constitution. I mean, certainly the civil rights movement circa Martin Luther King appealed to the Constitution. But once we started to get, the rise of more identity-based groups, then, there's like, this is in our Constitution. The Constitution enslaved Black people. The Constitution the Constitution has a lot of sins, or at least was associated with a lot of sins. And they'd rather just talk about contemporary American politics rather than venerating the Constitution. Now, the one thing that I did find very interesting in the Posen article is that they said that the shift came about in the 1970s and the 1980s. What's interesting is that prior to 1970, during the heyday of civil rights movement, the liberal Democrats appealed to the Constitution a lot. They did as part of the civil rights movement. So in a sense that they're post Martin Luther King, post, the political thought of liberalism in the civil rights movement and Franklin Roosevelt, they no longer, after that, beginning in the 70s and 80s, they no longer wanted to even talk about the Constitution. What they tend to talk about is public policy, right? We want this, we want that, we want this program, we want that program. And the assumption is if we want it, if it's good, then it's constitutional. They don't want to talk in terms of fundamental law, And so I think there's an apprehension about talking about the Constitution, and there's an apprehension about talking about a common good. There are a few dissident Democrats or liberals or progressives, Jedediah Purdy at Columbia Law School. I mean, they tend to let's talk about the common good, but it's such a fringe. The Democrats don't like that. So I definitely think there's a lot.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll go there and then here.
Thank you so much for being here, for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I wonder if you could say more about the propositionalism that you mentioned, the moralists embrace. I know like Harry Jaffa and others embrace Lincoln and the Civil War. And I wonder if this propositionalism can lead to like a radical politics or a kind of existentialism that leads to sort of extra constitutional action.
Yes. Look, that's my view of it. I mean, I'm very critical of it. I was always kind of critical of it, but certainly in the age of Trump, I'm even more critical of it. Obviously, this is, for those of you who don't know, I'll explain what it is in a second. But this is the one branch of the conservative intellectual movement that's been all in for Donald Trump. Right? That they love Donald Trump. At least as a vehicle. I mean, they don't like his morals. So propositionalism. So the proposition is there is such a thing as, well, John Courtney Murray, a Jesuit who also does it, refers to this as the American proposition. And they take it from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, right? You're endowed by natural rights, right? Endowed by our Creator with natural rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The argument is that that is the foundation of the American Republic. Okay? That is the American proposition. And they're critical of the founding. They're critical of the founding because unless you commit to that proposition, moral proposition, and live by it, right, you open yourself up to what Straussians of the school of political philosophers call moral relativism, historicism, the idea that there are no eternal truths that transcend the moment, right? And that everything is will. popular will and power. That, and the American regime embodied the failure to commit to that proposition when it allowed chattel slavery at the founding. So the founding is deeply flawed. And what the Jaffa propositionalists say is what happened after that is there arose these great figures who stood up and were willing to commit themselves to this proposition, right? And the examples they typically alight on are, they always talk about the Declaration and its promise. Frederick Douglass talked about the Declaration, and Abraham Lincoln talked about the Declaration, central to all of these people's thought. And they argue that essentially that the Constitution can only be understood in relation to this foundational truth and moral law. Okay? And that in the political thought of Abraham Lincoln, especially, right, this was realized. Okay, now let me say something good about this. Okay, here's my, I have a lot of problems with this, right? I mean, look, in a certain sense, obviously it's right. You know, what happens is you can get backed into saying, well, I hate Frederick Douglass, I hate Abraham Lincoln, and slavery was right. No, that's not what I'm saying, right? Look, this is obviously a good strain of political thought. It's what they do with it. And what they do with it is they're constantly asking people whether you commit to this proposition or whether you don't commit to this proposition. Do you believe or don't you believe? Are you faithful or not? Right? And to me, and to others, it develops a religious dynamic where you profess your faith or you're on the road to Nazism, right? Which is what they say, or Soviet totalitarianism. And so it demands a certain profession of faith. I think that very often it's detached from, you know, what other people would argue, an adherence to the more humane values of this. It's almost like a religious test. It can become a religion. Now, let me say something good about this, which I said I was going to do. Okay? I think, again, mostly I think of like my value added in all of this is in the developmental context, thinking about how things come to the fore and put in the background across time. One thing that Jaffa does is he takes a movement that is associated with racism and segregation, right? And particularly one of the leading constitutional theories on the right in the mid-20th century is states' rights, resistance to Brown v. Board of Education, right? And, you know, a lot of the conservative movement, Barry Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? There were voting rights issues, right? And not incidentally, you know, Jaffa also, you know, argued that this was about national politics. The national government should be empowered to enforce these moral propositions. That was like this with the civil rights movement, right? So one thing propositionalism did is saying, no, slavery was morally wrong. Segregation is morally wrong. Racism is morally wrong. It's a moral issue. And we need to not ignore, but you know, think above whatever the law happens to be and think about the higher moral claims. And look, one of the people they also talk about a lot is Martin Luther King, you know, because he also in his I Have a Dream speech talks about the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note, right? So Jaffa and the propositionalists brought that back in. National power, anti-racism, you know, moral public policies, anti-segregation, and look, once the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 are passed, that's pretty much the death knell for the old states' rights structuralist arguments, right? So this is the beginning of the ascent of Jaffa, I thought, okay? So I think in its moment, like I'm much more sympathetic to it. Like, it seems like the pro-civil rights conservatism of the late sixties, at least, even though this book is a little, right? That's Straussianism, right? It's on the right side of the main political issue. But here's the thing. Obviously, that's not what it's being, no, this doesn't mean you have to be for it or against it. I'm just saying that that's done, right? They're no longer talking about racism. To the extent they are talking about racism, the Jaffa'ite propositionalists today, it's a colorblind version of racism, which Martin Luther King probably didn't share. It doesn't mean that it's not right or appropriate, but it's not the civil rights movement, most of the civil rights movement. But they've shifted it. They're not focused fighting segregation. What they've shifted it to are abortion, gay rights, and I don't even know what else I'm leaving out, you know? I mean, let's just go with that. It's culture war issues. Probably gun control. Yeah. I mean, they've shifted it to the culture war issues. And the idea, but they've imported the same dynamic where moral foundations are the most important, right? The equality of natural rights, it's the equality of natural rights of the fetus. It's the equality, natural rights means natural rights, which means not unnatural rights. I actually went to a talk by Harry Jaffa in his old age. I remember two things about this talk. One, he insisted that Thomas Jefferson was a disciple of St. Thomas Aquinas, which was very bizarre. I think you know much about anything about Jefferson, very unlikely, right? And that Thomas Aquinas was more essential to the American founding than John Locke. Okay, it's like I was sitting next to a guy named Paul Sigmund, who put together the Summa Theologica and was a liberal Catholic and a proponent of natural law. And the whole time he's at the edge of his seat going, no, you know, wrong. Well, he spent half his time talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, you know, and the other half of the time denouncing sodomites and how sodomites are taking over the country, you know? So that's the other the natural law thing, right? So against unnatural sex, unnatural gender roles, you know, unnatural anything, right? It's all about culture war issues. And it's not just that, right? If you don't adhere to those natural law principles, you are a legal positivist. You believe that might makes right. That means you're not on the side of Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. You're on the side of Stephen Douglas and the Confederate South. And if you have no way of judging by a higher law, natural law, that doesn't make you any different from Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. Now, and by the way, and that makes you practically pro-slavery, right? Now, those Stalin, Hitler in the past, pro-slavery in the past, but he says the Democratic Party is the inheritor of the pro-slavery position. They're the inheritor of the Hitler philosophy. They're the inheritor of the Stalinist view that might makes right. And that's the Trump thing. It's not that they like Donald Trump. It's that in a very famous article, I don't know if you read it, called The Flight 93 Election, right? In the Claremont Review of Books, which is the main outlet for this thing. A leading Straussian named Michael Anton, West Coast Jaffa'ite, says the situation of the United States in the election of Donald Trump in 2016 is like the situation of the passengers on one of the hijacked jets going towards the World Trade Center. You either storm the cockpit to stop Hillary Clinton, right? Or the plane is definitely going down, right? And Donald Trump is in the position, we have to vote for Donald Trump, otherwise the Democrats will literally destroy America, right? They are terrorists. That's the argument, right? And that's my problem with propositionalism, right? That look at its basic sense about the Lincoln-Douglas debates and all these things, and certainly in a civil rights context. But this is where, again, it's a stupid version of it, but the idea that Joe Biden is like, you know, the second coming of Hitler or something like that is just, you know, it gets into weird it's also been popularized, right? I mean, it's been taken in a kind of watered down version by various fringe news outlets. But they're all fine with it because they're like, well, we need to get ourselves in office. Donald Trump will appoint us to the Justice Department, to the federal bench. And in fact, that's true. That he will, and that these people are now entering the judiciary. And I didn't mention in my talk, but they're starting to have an influence on the selection of judges and training judges. That this view is ascendant for the time being, but I don't think that's unrelated to some of the craziness of the politics. So I don't know. I mean, that's a very long answer, but it's something that obviously preoccupies me. Is that,
Yes, thank you.
there was, yeah.
I have a question, because here, like the United States, like constitutional theory is normally associated with the British common law tradition. But that seems like here, like in your chapter, when you talked about the
I
main.
don't agree with that, by the way. But go ahead.
No, I'm not saying, I'm just traditionally associated. I didn't say that, I'm not making an affirmation, just gonna say how is traditionally taught things. But then here, like in your book, when you bring like the main influence of this new conservative approach to constitutional interpretation, is interesting, like the three main influences, like Leo Strauss, which was from like a Jewish background, and his first book was Philosophy and Law, which has a very peculiar understanding of law, which is not based on the common law tradition at all. And then the second one is like the Catholic tradition, which also has a very unique understanding of the law, which is not like associated with the American tradition also. And also the third one was Eric Vogelin, which was like a German legal scholar, which also brings a very different like component to the American tradition. And then my question to you is like, at least this conservative approach is moving more to a like European understanding of legal and constitutional theory rather than the traditional American constitutional law?
Yes, okay, so I apologize.
Yeah,
So I do agree with you, yes.
So-
Okay, look, there is a lot to these, look, I don't know where history and tradition falls on this yet. It's a little, actually, I would say that's European too. I would say that's European too, but that's, like, it's more complicated, but, I think it's definitely more European. And I think Strauss and Catholic thought but let me just focus on Strauss for the moment, right? Leo Strauss, did you read any of Leo Strauss in your class? So those in this class, I don't know. Look, I mean, he's a German Jewish refugee from Nazism. And he lands at the New School for Social Research first, and then at the University of Chicago, where he teaches political theory. And a lot of these people, including Jaffa, are direct students of Leo Strauss. Okay, so they are Straussians. That's what we call a Straussian, student of Leo Strauss, who's sort of continuing Strauss's teaching. Look, a lot of what I said about the Declaration of Independence and this concern about moral foundations and this critique of legal positivism of pure human will or power as a source of law, was in Leo Strauss's book, Natural Right and History, in the first chapter. It's either the first or the second chapter. So which Strauss talks about the Declaration of Independence too. Okay, and Jaffa is really building on that. And what Jaffa is really doing is kind of just importing that into the American context to sort of give it an American historical framing and focus on the Lincoln-Douglas debates as saying this was our Straussian moment, right? The Lincoln-Douglas debates. So here's my thing about Leo Strauss, though. Look, this is just my opinion, and look, I'm just going to say it because this is what I think. I think Leo Strauss, two things. One, I'm going to commit a Straussian heresy. I'm going to historicize Leo Strauss. You know, Leo Strauss was a German Jewish refugee from the Nazis, and therefore foremost in his mind is going to be an understanding of what led the Nazis to come to power and want to exterminate the Jews, etc. Right? And for a philosopher like Strauss, he pins this to a philosophical error, a wrong turn in political thought in favor of positivism. Right? And so, look, I forgive the guy because A, anyone lives within their own time. Right? And that was one of the major understandings of what led to the rise of Hitler and also incidentally Stalin and communism, but especially Hitler. Right?
You can just explain what is positivism.
Positivism is the idea that this ultimate source of law is human beings. In other words, not God, not some law of nature, that we make our own laws and live under them. And that law should be understood and approached as a man-made thing. I'm losing a good word, right? Is that legal positivism, right? That God law comes from man. So the idea is then that, you know, under Nazism, who is to criticize, and it's also tied to sovereignty, right? Who's to criticize? In Germany, he came to power legally, right? They're doing what the Germans wanted, and no one can stand outside that and judge it, right? So that's what Strauss is thinking, that it's this philosophical error. And therefore he comes to America, and that's what he's talking about. Positivism versus natural law. We have to come down on, or natural right, whatever term he's using at the time, that we need that. And, you know, fine, right? But we have to commit to moral foundations and transcendent truth. Look, that makes a lot of sense. And certainly in that context, it makes a lot of sense. Look, it's not a new issue. I mean, it goes back to like Antigone or something like that, right? This idea that there's a higher law versus a new thing. Okay. But here's the thing, right? I've asked people who are experts on, look, when did Strauss write this? When was this book? 1947? 1953? Anyway, late 40s, early 50s. Okay. Guess what? Right? I hate to be a historicist, but people have studied what led to the rise of the Nazis since then. And most historians do not attribute it to a philosophical error. Right? That there are all sorts of complicated reasons, right, that led to the rise of the Nazis. And it wasn't just an era of philosophy. And in fact, you know, some of the leading people who've written about this say it wasn't Hitler, you know, and it wasn't legal positivism even, right? That Hitler didn't believe in, he believed in Volk. You know, I mean, anyway, I'm not going to get into it, and I'm not really that good at it, but I know people who are good at it. And you know, that Strauss misunderstood what led to the rise of Nazism. And again, I'm not blaming him because this is prior to 60 years of historical scholarship on it. So that's fine. But my thing is, you can't just decide because you've studied with Leo Strauss that you're going to understand the rise of Nazism as it was understood in 1953 forever. Right? That is bad thinking. I'm sorry. It's not bad thinking for Strauss because he was writing it in 1953. But if you're like, whatever Strauss said caused Nazism in 1953, I don't want to hear anything else. He knew. Right? Baloney. Right? The other thing is that Strauss then had certain things he liked about America. Right? And one thing he thought that was great about America was how vibrant a religious life, right? It's Christian foundation, even though he's Jewish. I mean, that gets complicated. There are not that many Jews, I hate to tell you, right? I mean, it has to be Christians in the United States. And, you know, he thought that, he refers to this as Athens and Jerusalem, right? That the best polity, the flourishing polity, right, is going to have a foot in the camp of Athens, which is reason and philosophy, and in Jerusalem, which is faith, right? And therefore, so he was very big on faith, right, and religious faith. Here's another thing. This I do have a problem with Leo Strauss. Again, I don't know enough about Strauss. People can tell me at dinner, but I don't think he understood the slightest thing about American religion. You know, what would he have understood? He would have understood Catholic theology. You know, he would have understood European thought about religious thought, right? But he would not have understood sort of vernacular American religion, right? And I just think that it was malpractice of him to go talking about how essential faith was in the American context. I think it's no accident that, you know, we're getting the Donald Trump Bible, you know? Because Leo Strauss says religion is always good for a polity. My view is there's no such thing as religion, right? I don't mean that literally, but I mean, there's no one type of religion, right? And it does matter which type it is. And the type that suits Leo Strauss, and I think that he was probably thinking of, was sophisticated Catholic theology, right? That he knew best. Where, I mean, Thomism comes out of Aristotle, comes out of the sort of reasoned philosophical approach to matters of faith and life. And I just think that in an American context, to assume that religion is going to be of that variety it's not true. He probably didn't leave Chicago or New York very much. I mean, I don't know how much time he spent in Oklahoma. But you know, it just seems like, and again, maybe I won't blame Leo Strauss for that either, right? Because again, Leo Strauss is living at a particular time. But I think his followers should be more self-reflective about religion. So I don't know. That's kind of my answer. That's kind of my answer to at least the statement on your question. But look, the Catholic theology has become increasingly important, and Strauss has become increasingly important. Look, I teach at Boston College, which is a Catholic university, and we are a Straussian department. So I'm surrounded by these people. And the Catholicism and the Straussianism are different, but they fit together very nicely, right? Now, the Straussians don't believe in God, but they also believe that they shouldn't tell anyone that, you know, because that's only for the philosopher that can stand a godless universe. But they're not separate. I don't see them as separate. I see them as adjuncts to each other with slightly, they're all concerned with the same questions and problems, even if they're radically different.
Yeah, just to get off the Strauss train here for a second.
Yes.
Judicial review is sort of slandered as judicial activism if you don't like the outcomes, I think. But the third prong of a conservative approach to constitutionalism, if you called it traditionalist approach, what was the language that you used?
Well, some people called it traditionalism and some called it history and tradition.
Okay,
So now they call it living tradition.
So living traditionalism, like, so if you're a judicial activist and you regard the Constitution as a living document, that's all bad if you don't like the outcomes. But if you do own the bench, if you do have the judiciary on your side, then it can be a living document or heritage interpretation or something. It seems to me that this, I mean, maybe you just say a little bit more about this the newest wave of conservative approach to constitutional. How is it not just judicial activism that you like for which you like the outcomes?
I don't know what it is.
Okay.
I mean,
Can you remind us who we might
Mark.
DiGirolamo.
Yes, Girolami, but Sharif Gurgis, he's at Notre Dame Law School, and the other ones that the Girolami is at Catholic University, he was at St. John's University. They're both law professors. There are probably some others, but you know, look, obviously, in a certain sense, to talk about looking at post-ratification practices, right? That has been a third rail for the originalists because it seems to untether the judge from
a fixed law, right, and give them discretion and subjectivity, right, to change the law to adapt with the times. Okay, and that's what people often call judicial activism. Certainly the originalists call it judicial activism. I'm not quite sure yet what the game these people are playing is, right? Look, I think it's pretty clear. Well, I will say this, right? There is very little attraction to advocating for a passive judiciary when it's your judges from your party who are on the bench. That they were fine to call for judicial restraint when it was liberal Democratic judges. How many conservatives are going to spend their time talking about judicial restraint when it's Amy Coney Barrett, Clarence Thomas, who are deciding what laws are getting struck down? So to a certain extent, they are frankly abandoning the judicial restraint posture. Now, there's a more subtle answer to that, which is it's never judicial activism if you're striking down a law based on what the Constitution truly means. Right? So the test isn't deference to the legislature. The test is substantive, whether you got it right or you got it wrong, according to the Constitution. So they would say, look, we're not being activist, right? We are deferring to the practices of average Americans, and we're deferring to American culture. Now, it does seem to approach the old liberal view, and I think it does. You know, it seems a lot to me like what liberals advocated as living constitutionalism. Here's the difference, though. The question, of course, is what you reference as the history of Americans and what you reference as the common practice of Americans. I mean, one thing that really struck me was the Second Amendment case, Bruin, where Clarence Thomas, in applying this methodology, said we need to look to understand what the Second Amendment means, the right to keep and bear arms means. We don't look just to the founding. We look to the practices of the American people in regulating arms. Right? And this was something. They got an amicus brief from all of 98% of the leading historians of the history of arms in America. And Clarence Thomas says, we need not look at this. This is basically he says, I don't respect these people and this is wrong. Right? He dismissed out of hand the histories of that practice. You know, this is probably temporary when they're writing their own books on the Second Amendment history. They're rewriting the history. That's what I think, quite frankly. They're writing their own histories, right? That they can reference to talk about the common practices of Americans. And they're sidestepping the leading current historians of this. And so I think it's going to be phrased as deference to the American people. But look, I mean, liberals would call it activism.